You're listening to Al Pastor, the show that helps you love God, love your neighbor, and eat more tacos. I'm your host, Pastor Brian. Welcome to the show. Hey, friends, I want to welcome you to another podcast. We are looking at John chapter 21. We're on the final stretch of our journey in this beautiful and wonderful gospel. I don't know about you, but this has been an incredible journey in the life of Jesus and the life of his disciples. And I'm a little sad to see this portion come to an end, but I'm also excited at the same time to get into the writings, the letters, the epistles of John, because that's where we're going next. 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. So I want to start today's episode, and I'm gonna try to go through as many verses as possible. But I want to give you a full disclaimer here. John 21 is what is known as a contested chapter in the Bible. You say, well, what do you mean by that? And why are you even letting us know? Well, I want to read the little introduction to the Life Application New Testament commentary. And this is noted not just by them, but just almost by all the different commentators and scholars who write anything with John. So listen to what they say. They say chapter 21 is an epilogue to John's narrative. Very likely, John decided to add this chapter sometime after he completed his gospel in order to clarify the misconception about the relationship between his death and the Lord's return. The rumor that John would not die before the Lord's return had to be corrected. Otherwise, the church might experience great trouble at his death before the Lord's return. John, therefore, decided to add a chapter that would make it clear that Jesus did not say that he would return before John died. Now, generally speaking, I agree with the majority of the Life Application commentary, but in this case, I see the case that they're making. I just wish they would have expanded it a little more. I think the one that handles it the best is a scholar by the name of Edward Klink. And he writes, and this is called the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary of the New Testament. He makes a very compelling case because, believe it or not, the amount of scholars that contest this chapter, it's huge. There are a lot. And so part of his case is, number one, that all of the manuscripts that have been found and attested to, and by the way, there are over 5,000 New Testament manuscripts just in itself, they all include John 21. Now, why would we say that this is added on later by John, or even some, what we would say, critical liberal scholars would even say, well, this wasn't even written by the hand of John. And you might think, well, where do they get that from? Well, they do it through linguistic analysis and vocabulary, and they say it wasn't written by the hand of John. Well, I think that there is a case for a strong disagreement here. In fact, I believe that John 21 is a brilliant way to close out his gospel. So here's the first thing. None of the manuscripts ever omit this particular chapter. None of them. I think that in itself should be conclusive enough to close that case. But here's where it gets even better. John is, when we begin to talk about the masterful way that God has inspired the different authors to write, many scholars would note, for instance, Luke. His usage of and mastery of the Greek language. But John isn't necessarily mastering the language as far as linguistic ways of using like big, huge words, but the way that he layers things together is absolutely brilliant. Now, again, of course, we know that part of the doctrine of the Bible, that it is inspired, is that God gave men the ability to write. He inspired them, but they still used the gifts and resources that God had available to them. Now, John opens up his gospel with what is known as the prologue. That is chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. Now, directly after, from verse 19 down to 51, is what we would call a second prologue or an introduction. Now, they complement each other, and this literary structure, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing what Edward Klink says. This literary structure is very unique to John. So he opens with a prologue and then a complementary introduction. Here's where it's amazing to me, and I didn't get this from Klink, but Genesis opens the exact same way. You say, well, what do you mean? Chapter 1 there are two creation accounts, chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 gives us of Genesis the introduction to creation, and then there's a retelling of the creation in chapter 2. Well, I want you to think of John doing the same thing. He opened his gospel in the same way, and he's closing his gospel in the same way. So when scholars go and they identify the closing verses of chapter 20, right? Like, these things were written that you might believe. They were like, well, that's where John's gospel should have ended. And they have a very hard time reconciling John 21. Here's the thing, folks. It's not a big deal. John is paralleling his introduction with his conclusion. So John 21 is incredible. It wouldn't even make sense if we were just left hanging, sort of say, about Peter and John. I mean, the tie-ins that Jesus brings, or that John brings, to the table concerning John and Peter and their encounter with Jesus is a beautiful, beautiful picture. He commissions them, and in turn, he commissions us as well. And so I wanted to just take some time to kind of address that. And this may be a big deal to some, may not be. It may be a big nothing burger to others. But as I was going through the introduction of our discipleship guides, I said, I wonder if some people would scratch their heads a little bit, and then maybe it would cause them to do some more research if they had other resources. So I say all that to say that if you want, I have an in-depth look from the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary. I can make that available to you. I would highly encourage you to purchase the book, but it may not serve you well now that we're ending the Gospel of John. But I can include this because I think he does a really, really good job of combating some of the, what we would call, quote unquote, critical scholarship when it comes to this area. I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and close out this episode with this before I get into chapter 1. Got that all out of the way. If you have any thoughts or you have any questions, if you have researched this, if you have studied it out, feel free to let me know. Reach out if you got any further questions. And like I said, I am more than willing to post the in-depth look on the validity of chapter 21. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for listening to Al Pastor with Brian Overturf. If you found value in this, please subscribe and get updates most places podcasts are available. We're right here on Anchor FM through Spotify, also on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and iHeartRadio. I hope you'll tune in for the next episode. Until then, we'll see you later.